I don't usually hear from nurses, not because they don't have stories. I think it's the opposite. I think they have more than most, and they've learned to keep them. There's a professional cost to telling certain kinds of stories when your name is attached to a hospital, a license, a career built on being believed. Claire Voss contacted me in February of this year. She asked for 3 things: that I not name the hospital, that I not name the city beyond the state, and that I wait until she had transferred to a different facility. She transferred in March. She told me I could post this in April. Claire is a registered nurse, 8 years of experience, the last 4 at a regional medical center in southwestern Virginia. She worked the overnight shift on a surgical recovery ward, Ward 4, for 2 of those years. She is describing one night, March 14th, 2023. I want to be clear about something before I start. I've seen a lot of things in 8 years of nursing. I've been present when people died. I've watched families fall apart in waiting rooms. I've worked understaffed through 2 winters that I don't talk about. I'm not squeamish and I'm not fragile and I don't spook easily. I'm telling you that because I need you to take seriously what I'm about to describe. Not because it's supernatural. I'm not claiming it's supernatural. I'm claiming it happened, and that I still don't have an explanation that covers all of it, and that the one explanation that does cover all of it is something I am not ready to say out loud with my name attached, so I'm saying it here instead. March 14th, 2023, Tuesday night into Wednesday morning. I came on at 11 p.m., standard overnight shift. Ward 4 is surgical recovery, post-op patients mostly, hip replacements, gallbladder, the occasional more serious procedure. On a good night, it's quiet. Patients are sedated or sleeping. You're monitoring vitals, doing rounds, managing pain requests. Boring mostly. Boring is what you want. That night I was working with 2 other nurses, Patel and a travel nurse named Drew, whose last name I never learned. Drew was covering for someone on leave. It was his 3rd week on the ward. The charge nurse that night was a man named Garrett, Len Garrett. He'd been at that hospital for 11 years. I'd worked with him maybe 40 times. Steady, quiet. The kind of charge nurse who makes a shift feel contained. You always knew where he was, what he was doing, what the plan was. I'm going to come back to Garrett. We had 9 patients on the ward that night. I was assigned 4 of them. Rooms 14, 15, 17, and 19. Room 16 was empty. A same-day discharge had left it vacant that afternoon. At 11:30 p.m., I did my first round. 14, 15, 17, all stable, sleeping or close to it. Standard post-op presentations. 19 was a 67-year-old man named, I'm going to call him Mr. Aldrich, admitted after an emergency appendectomy that afternoon. His surgery had gone well. He was sedated, vitals normal. No concerns flagged in the handoff. I checked his chart. I checked his IV line. I adjusted his blanket because it had slipped. He opened his eyes. This happens. Patients come in and out of sedation at unpredictable rates. I said his name. I said, "You're in the hospital. Your surgery went well. You're going to be fine." Standard orientation. He looked at me without speaking for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "The one in the hallway." I said, "I'm sorry?" He said it again. "The one in the hallway. Don't let it in." Then his eyes closed. I stood at his bedside for a moment. Post-operative confusion is common. anesthesia, disorientation, pain. Patients say things that don't track. I noted it in his chart and moved on. I did not look at the hallway immediately. I want to be honest about that. I deliberately did not look at the hallway for about 10 seconds. I finished noting the chart entry. Then I looked. The hallway was empty. The hallway lighting on Ward 4 at night is low, about 40%, enough to see clearly, but reduced for patient comfort. It was empty in both directions. The nurse's station at the far end was lit, and I could see Patel at the desk. Nothing in the hallway. I went to room 15 to recheck a post-op patient who'd been running a low-grade fever on handoff, 12:15 a.m. Drew found me in the medication room. He asked if I'd done a check on the room 16, the empty one. I said no, why would I? It was empty. He said he'd walked past it 20 minutes ago and the call light was on. I said, "The room is empty, Drew." He said, "I know. That's why I'm mentioning it." We went to room 16 together. The call light was off when we got there. The room was empty, stripped bed, no equipment running except the standard monitoring hookups left in standby, the way they always are between patients. Drew said, "It was definitely on." I said, "Could have been a short. Those old panels short sometimes." He said, "Sure." Then he said, and he said it in a way that made me pay attention in a lower register than the rest of the conversation. He said, "Has the room always been that cold?" I noticed it then. I hadn't when I first walked in, but once he said it, I noticed it. The room was noticeably colder than the hallway. Not dramatically. 4 or 5 degrees maybe. Enough to be wrong. Rooms on Ward 4 are individually climate-controlled. They run warm. Patients post-surgery run cold, and we keep the ward between 70 and 72. Room 16 had been empty since 4 p.m. It should have been the same temperature as everything else. I checked the thermostat panel. It read 68. I reset it to 72. I told Drew it was probably the HVAC cycling oddly on an empty room. He nodded. He said, "Sure." He didn't look like he thought it was the HVAC. We went back to the hall. 1 a.m. Rounds. Room 19. Mr. Aldrich. He was awake, properly awake this time, tracking, oriented, knew his name and where he was. His vitals were good. I asked about his pain level, and he said 4, which was appropriate. I adjusted his medication schedule. Before I left, he said, "The person I saw earlier, with the light, were they a doctor?" I said, "I'm sorry?" He said, "When I woke up before, there was someone at the door with a light. I thought it was one of the doctors doing rounds." I said, "That was probably me checking your chart." He said, "It wasn't you. It was a man. He was shining a small light into the room, like he was looking for something." I said, "That's likely another nurse. We do check the rooms." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "He wasn't wearing scrubs." I wrote it in his chart. Post-operative visual disturbance, patient-oriented and stable. I flagged it as low concern. I went to the nurse's station and pulled up the overnight access log, the system that tracks badge swipes for every door on the ward. Routine. I do it occasionally when patients report unfamiliar staff. It's easier than tracking someone down. The access log for Ward 4 showed 3 badge entries since 11 p.m. Mine, Patel's, and Drew's. No one else had entered the ward. I found Garrett at 1:30 a.m. This is where I need to be careful about how I say things, because what I'm describing is a feeling before it was a fact, and I'm aware of how that sounds. Garrett was at the end of the hall near the supply room. He was standing with his back to me, looking at something on his clipboard. Normal. I'd seen him in that exact posture dozens of times. I called his name. He turned around. And I know Garrett. I've said that. 40 shifts, 2 years. I know how he carries himself. I know his face under the ward lighting. I know the way he moves. Nurses know their charge. Nurses the way you know anyone you've worked closely with for a long time. Not just recognition, physical familiarity, posture, gait, the specific way someone turns when you call their name. He turned around and everything was exactly right. Except his eyes. Not wrong in a way I could document. Not medically abnormal. Just the quality of attention in them was different. When Garrett looked at you, he was present. 20-year nurse. That kind of person is fully present when they look at you. There's engagement. What I saw when he turned around was the absence of that. Eyes that were working correctly but empty of whatever usually filled them. It lasted 1 second, maybe less. Then he said, "Boss, everything okay?" His voice was normal. His expression was normal. He was holding the clipboard the way he always held it. I said, "Fine, just checking in." He nodded and turned back to the clipboard. I walked back to the nurse's station and I sat down and I thought about what I had just seen and I told myself, "You're tired. It's 1:30 a.m. You're reading things into a man's face that aren't there." I almost convinced myself. 2:10 a.m. Patel came to find me. She looked, I want to be precise. She looked the way people look when they've decided to say something they've been sitting on, like the decision had just been made. She said, "Has Garrett seemed okay to you tonight?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said she'd asked him about a patient's pain protocol at midnight and he'd given her an answer that was technically correct, but she paused. She said, "It took him too long to get there, like he was translating." I said, "Translating?" She said, "Like the answer was coming from somewhere that wasn't immediate. You know how someone sounds when they're repeating something they memorized versus when they actually know it? Like that." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "I'll check on him." She said, "He went into room 16 about 10 minutes ago." I said, "Why would he go into an empty room at 2 a.m.? She said, "That's why I'm telling you." I went to room 16. The door was closed. There's a small window in each door on Ward 4. Standard safety glass, a foot wide, at eye level. I looked through it before I opened the door. Garrett was inside. He was standing at the window, the exterior window, the one that faces the parking structure, with his back to the door. The room was dark except for the ambient light from outside coming through the blinds. He was not doing anything, not checking equipment, not on his phone, standing at the window with both hands at his sides, looking out. At 2:10 a.m., in an empty patient room, I opened the door. He turned around immediately, Fast. Faster than the earlier turn in the hallway. Like he'd been listening for the door. He said, "Voss?" I said, "Len, what are you doing in here?" He said, "Checking the room. 16 scheduled to fill in the morning. I wanted to make sure the setup was right." I said, "At 2 a.m.? He said, "I do a full room check before handoff. You know that." I do know that. He does do room checks before handoff. At 5 a.m., not at 2. I said, "The temperature in here was low earlier." Drew noticed it. He said, "HVAC thing." I called facilities. I said, "When?" He said, "Earlier." I stood in the doorway and I looked at him, and he looked back at me, and his face was Garrett's face, and his voice was Garrett's voice, and everything about him was Garrett. Except he was standing in a dark, empty room at 2 a.m., and he could not give me a straight timeline on a single thing he'd done that night. I said, "Okay, I'll let you finish." He said, "Almost done." I went back to the hall. I did not go far. I stood just past the sight line of the door window and I counted. He came out of the room 4 minutes later. He walked past me without stopping. He said, "Go check on 14. I think the IV alarm is about to trip." I checked room 14. The IV alarm was fine. When I came back to the hall, Garrett was at the nurse's station writing in a chart like nothing had happened. I want to stop here because I spent a significant amount of time trying to find a framework for what Claire is describing. I want to be careful. What she's describing is behavioral, subtle. Nothing she's documenting in this account would constitute a formal complaint, a reportable incident, or an actionable anything. A charge nurse standing in an empty room. Eyes that seemed vacant for a moment. Slow answers. But I made some calls. I spoke, off the record, with a former administrator at a regional medical center, not the one Claire worked at. I described the pattern she'd noticed in Garrett without identifying anyone. The administrator said, "That pattern, the knowledge that sounds memorized, the wrong room behavior, the eye contact thing. We had a situation with a staff member once that fit that profile." I asked what the situation was. She said, "Impairment, but not substance. The toxicology was clean. The psych eval was inconclusive. He resigned before anything was formally concluded." I asked what the working theory had been. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "There were a few. The one that nobody wanted to put in writing was that something had happened to him in the building. Not to him exactly, more like something had happened to the version of him that showed up for work." I asked her to explain. She said, "I can't. That's why nobody put it in writing." Back to Claire. 3:40 a.m. Mr. Aldrich called me on the room buzzer. I went in. He was sitting up, more alert than he should have been at that hour post-surgery, but sometimes adrenaline does that. He looked at me when I came in and something in him visibly relaxed. He said, "The man came back." I said, "Which man?" He said, "The one without scrubs." He stood at the door again. He was shining the light around the room again. He said, "This time he came in." My mouth went dry. I said, "Did he approach you? Did he touch you? Or the equipment?" Mr. Aldrich said, "No. He stood at the foot of the bed. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the monitors. Then he left. I said, "What did he look like?" Mr. Aldrich thought about it. He said, "Tall, dark jacket. He had a light, like a small flashlight or a phone. He was shining it at the monitors." I said, "At the monitors specifically?" He said, "Like he was reading them, like he was checking something." I checked every monitor in room 19. Every reading was correct. Nothing had been adjusted, nothing had been touched. I checked the door log again at the nurse's station. No new badge entries since my last check. I stood at the station and I looked at the access log and I thought about the thing that the log confirmed and the thing that the log could not address. The log confirmed no one had entered the ward through the badge-controlled doors. The log said nothing about anyone who was already inside. 4:55 a.m., 20 minutes before shift change. I was doing final chart entries at the station. Patel was nearby. Drew had gone to do pre-handoff checks on his patients. Garrett came to the station. He set his clipboard down. He said, "Good shift, everyone." Standard end of shift language. Normal. I looked up at him. And I said, I don't know why I said it, it wasn't planned. I said, "Len, what was in room 16 tonight?" He looked at me. Not the vacant look from before. A different look. A very focused, very still look. The kind of look that is its own answer. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You were in there at 2 a.m., in the dark, just standing at the window." He said, "I told you, pre-handoff room check." I said, "You do those at 5. He said, "I moved it up tonight." He held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then he picked up his clipboard and walked to the far end of the station and began the handoff documentation. I looked at Patel. She had heard the whole thing. She looked at me and said nothing. She went back to her charts. Day shift came on at 7 a.m. I gave my handoff. I flagged Mr. Aldrich's reports of an unidentified male in his room. I flagged it as a patient concern requiring follow-up. Standard language. The day charge nurse noted it. As I was leaving, I passed Garrett in the hall. He was still there, double shift, or he'd stayed for some reason. He said, "Claire." I stopped. He said, "You're a good nurse, you pay attention." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Sometimes paying attention to the wrong things is as dangerous as not paying attention at all." He said it evenly, conversationally, the way you'd say anything. Then he walked away. I stood in the hallway for a moment, then I went home. I've transferred hospitals. I work at a different facility now in a different part of the state. I don't work overnight anymore. Personal preference, I told HR. They didn't ask why. I've looked into Garrett twice since that night. He's still at the same hospital. Still charge nurse on Ward 4 overnight. His employee profile, from what I can see, shows no disciplinary actions, no flags, nothing unusual. Mr. Aldrich, I was able to follow up through official channels. He was discharged on March the 16th, 2 days after that night. Recovery was normal, no complications. His discharge notes contain one notation that I flagged at the time and that I have thought about almost every day since. In the box where the discharging nurse documents final patient statements, a standard field, usually empty or containing something like "patient denies pain, ambulating well," someone wrote 4 words. Not a sentence, just 4 words. He said it watched. I don't know which nurse wrote it. I don't know if Mr. Aldrich said it to them directly or if it came from my earlier note. I don't know what he meant. I know that whoever wrote it didn't add a follow-up, didn't flag it for psych, just wrote it and moved on, like they already understood. I submitted a records request for Ward 4's incident log from March 14th to March 15th, 2023. The hospital's compliance office responded that the log was available for review under HIPAA-compliant conditions. It took 6 weeks to receive. The log for that night documents 3 items: a medication timing discrepancy, self-corrected, a patient call light malfunction in room 16, and a notation at 4:47 a.m. under the charge nurse's signature. Ward secure, no incidents. Len Garrett's signature. 13 minutes before I asked him about room 16, I also found something that I didn't go looking for. In a nursing staff forum, a closed professional group, I was granted access as a researcher. There's a thread from October 2022, 5 months before Claire's account. It's titled, "Weird Experience Ward 4 Overnight Looking for Anyone Else." The post is from a nurse who worked at the same hospital. She describes a single overnight shift. She describes a charge nurse who gave her directions she couldn't track. She describes a patient reporting an unidentified figure at the bedside. She describes a room that was cold. She left the hospital 2 weeks after posting. The thread has 11 replies. Every reply says some version of the same thing. DM me. None of the replies are public. The original poster's account was deleted 4 months ago. Her name was not Claire Voss.